This file falls directly under your authority. And if you can go back to the Indigenous communities in your riding and tell them that he should not be held to account, that what he does was just fine, I think they will have something to say about that.
Question period isn't the only place where Liberal ministers avoid giving direct answers. It happens in committee too. Yet the non-response from Liberal Minister Patty Hajdu to Garnet Genesis' question about Randy Boissonnault was unmistakably clear.
Let's take a look.
Mr. Genuous, go ahead, please. Minister, should Randy Boissonnault still be in cabinet?
Well, I can tell you that the business that Mr. Boissonnault was involved in was never on the Indigenous business directory.
Mm-hmm.
What?
So how could they bid for contracts for the Indigenous set-aside if they weren't on the list?
Well, that's a completely separate question. I'm just confused. Garnet asked her, should Minister Boissonnault still be in cabinet? And then she says, well, the business wasn't on the list. That wasn't even remotely the question. But it's interesting that all of the Liberal cabinet ministers have been given talking points based on Randy Boissonnault. Yeah, so it... I don't even know. I know that the business carried itself as Indigenous owned because it bid on contracts.
Right.
So,
but it wasn't on this magical list? Like,
it's bizarre.
Yeah, something stinks here.
Do you think he should still be in cabinet?
That's not a decision for me to make, Mr. Genuous.
Okay. It's interesting that you're not saying yes. Do you endorse his conduct as minister?
I can tell you that Mr. Boissonnault's business was never listed on the Indigenous business directory.
He's a cabinet colleague of yours. You work together closely, I would presume. I ask if you think he should stay in cabinet, and you're declining to answer that. Do you endorse his conduct as minister? What do you think of what he has done?
I can tell you that GHI, the business that Mr. Boissonnault was co-owner of, has never been on the IBD.
Okay, now I see what she's doing. I was a little slow on the uptake before, but now I see it crystal clear.
Yeah. Does everybody else see it?
I'm sure everybody caught it way sooner than I did, so you don't need to make fun.
No. For those that still don't know, go ahead and explain.
So she's just answering every single question about how Randy's business was not on this list. I didn't catch the acronym that she used, but it was a list of Indigenous businesses. It doesn't matter what Janice is asking her. That seems to be her like pre-canned response.
Yeah, she's been programmed by the Trudeau overlords to say this, no matter what the question about Randy Boissonnault seems to be. Now, this particular focus of OGO in this session is around the problems with Indigenous procurement. So this is fair game. This is actually not going out of bounds into other subject matter, as the Conservatives sometimes try to do.
Yeah, like when they send in Larry Brock to ask about something.
SNC-Lavalin. Right.
That was great.
Yeah. But in this case, it is absolutely fair game. And it's a question that is fairly put to the minister. Now, the interesting thing is she's not saying, oh, Randy's great. She's not saying that he's a capable minister. All she's saying is his business wasn't on the list.
Okay, I think you're saying a lot by not saying a lot, Minister, so I'll move on to my next question. Is Global Health Imports still eligible to receive government contracts?
I believe they are, but they are, as I said, not part of the Indigenous Business Directory. I can't answer in affirmative.
They represented themselves as Indigenous owned. They did so falsely. They are still eligible to receive government contracts. Do you think there should be penalties for companies that misrepresent their Indigenous identity? Should they be prevented from bidding further on government contracts?
In fact, there are penalties for fraudulent behavior, and I would hope that anybody that is procuring on behalf of the Government of Canada is careful about which businesses they procure from to make sure that proper business practices are followed. And certainly the Government of Canada has measures that it can take if it's found that businesses have acted fraudulently and should.
Okay. You mentioned there are consequences for fraudulent activity, which I hope would include misrepresentations around Indigenous identity. Did Global Health Imports, in your view, as the Indigenous Services Minister, engage in fraudulent activity?
I can't make that determination, but I can tell you that the Office of Supplier Integrity and Compliance with PSPC can take steps such as banning a business from future...
Sorry, I'll just jump in because I know there are options available, but okay, you don't want to rule specifically on the case of Global Health Imports. Let's take a hypothetical case where you have a company involved in health imports, let's say, that's owned by two people. Hypothetically, one of them happens to be a minister of the Crown, and they are bidding on government contracts and in the process claim to be an Indigenous-owned company. That claim turns out to be completely false. If that hypothetical company, in the process of pursuing government contracts, falsely claimed to be Indigenous-owned, would that be considered fraudulent activity?
Would it?
Who could this hypothetical company belong to?
The other Randy, of course.
Oh, that is true.
Certainly not Randy Boissonneau.
Randy B instead. Yes, it would be fraudulent. It would be 100% fraudulent. Let's just put that to bed.
It could possibly be, but that would be a decision by the Office of the Supplier Integrity and Compliance. I don't run that particular organization, so I would say that from my perspective, when there's allegations of fraud, it's very serious. And I think departments have a responsibility to ensure that they're procuring from companies that are not fraudulent. So
right, but just definitionally, right? Like it would seem that the definition of fraud is misrepresenting the facts in some way in order to achieve a commercial advantage. Right? Pretending something is true when it's not in order to achieve a commercial advantage. So you have a company that pretended to be Indigenous owned when it wasn't Indigenous owned. The purpose of that pretense was clearly to increase its chances of getting government contracts that it wouldn't have otherwise gotten. Is that fraud?
What I would say is I think we're saying the same thing, that the process of ensuring that people claiming indigeneity should be with integrity, because what we want is we want Indigenous economic success. So I think we agree. And I think that any time that there's fraud in terms of allegations of identity, that is a very serious infraction. Now, what happens next is up to places like the Office of Supplier Integrity, but I can tell you that we, on our side, in Indigenous Services Canada, take integrity around indigeneity seriously. Although it is challenging.
And let me jump in here.
Okay, so the Minister of Indigenous Services takes the process of proving your Indigenous heritage very seriously, but can't call it fraud when one of their colleagues is engaged with a company that said it was Indigenous to try to win government contracts when it was not.
Are you surprised, though?
No. It's just adding to the list of all of the ridiculous assertions and, I would say, non-acknowledgement from the most hypocritical government ever. Because remember, this government has run itself on identity politics, on feelings, on this whole concept of Indigenous like realignment, forgiveness, and all of this stuff. Well, we're going to do right by Indigenous people.
And then one of their ministers is doing this.
Yeah. Yeah. And they've called this guy Indigenous when he's not. They've had him as one of the poster people on the Indigenous caucus poster when he is not. They're not even calling him out when he's engaged in this stuff. They're not firing him. He's not resigning.
He's not off to Mendocino Island.
I think he will be soon.
I think so too, but they're taking their time.
Mendocino's lonely. He needs some company over there. So, but it's just astounding, the hypocrisy of this Liberal government, and they're all fine to just go along with it.
Well, I think at this point, they are trying to avoid any teeny tiny little thing that would make them look worse, that the Conservatives can use against them in the public eye, in the media, and also in an election campaign.
I would hope the Prime Minister would take that integrity seriously and fire this minister from cabinet. Just in the time that I have left, Minister, are there any other companies owned by Liberal cabinet ministers or MPs, former MPs, or Liberal appointed senators that are on the Indigenous business list?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that, but we can commit to checking that out for you and getting the information back.
So the Minister of Indigenous Services comes to committee, has seen all of the scandal blow up about GHI and Randy Boissonneau, and you haven't bothered to ask the question. Where's my surprise face when I need it? There will be no shocked Pikachu face in this video. That should be one of the first things that she did. But again, these Liberals, these ministers, all they do is they say, thanks for the $300,000 a year. I'm just going to lean back in my chair and put up my feet, collect my paycheck, and laugh at the Canadian taxpayer.
Mrs. Block for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to all of you joining us here today. Minister, we have heard repeatedly from Indigenous groups that the majority of the money that the government claims is going to Indigenous companies is actually going to shell companies and not Indigenous companies. And we've just read recently in the news a great example of this with the company owned by Randy Boissonneau. And even though GHI was not listed on the Indigenous Business Directory, and you made mention of that, I think your departmental officials know differently and have agreed that they are still eligible to receive funding from ISC. We've also heard that there are little to no consequences for companies who pretend to be Indigenous. And I want to quote Shannon Mehta-Tawabin, CEO of the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association. And they would have stated that there are very little penalties and that there need to be penalties for sure. And he actually went on to say it's criminal behavior to conduct fraud. So we have to take other steps and demonstrate to the world and to Canada that those actors who are engaging in this activity don't use this window and this program to access the federal government in a bad way. Do you agree that it's criminal behavior and that there should be penalties?
First of all, what I would say is I think we're saying the same thing in that Indigenous business procurement is a really critical aspect of Canada's economic growth, and we have to take
Minister,
it seriously. And
I asked a very direct question.
And I'm going to give you a very direct answer.
Then I would ask you to get to that answer, please.
Great. And as I was saying, and that's why it's so important that we ensure that there isn't fraud in the space of claiming indigeneity. Now, as you know, Indigenous Services Canada...
Minister, my question was, do you believe it's criminal behavior when a non-Indigenous company claims to be Indigenous to steal money from Indigenous-owned companies through the set-aside?
What I would say is that fraud is fraud.
Wow.
Wow, indeed.
You know what? She might not be answering now, but I saw Mr. Brock hanging out there behind Mrs. Brock. And I know that Michael Barrett's in the room as well. So I can't wait to see them have a go and see if they can get some answers.
Well, and here's the thing, folks. So if you don't recall or you didn't know, Kelly Block is the shadow minister for public service procurement services, or PSPC. Yves Duclos' job right now. So if and when the Conservative government, or Conservatives form government, excuse me, she will be in charge of the procurement arm of the government. So it's interesting to just watch Kelly work, considering that is her future minister position. And the person that is going to be designated at this point to be president of Treasury Board, which is Anita Anand's position, that handles basically all of the money that goes through the government, that is Stephanie Kuzy. So it's interesting just watching them work and asking these questions. And the fact that Patty Hajdu won't commit to saying, yes, that's a criminal act, that should bother every voter. Not just the Conservative voters, not just the, the people that aren't voting for the Liberals. That should bother Liberal voters.
Well, maybe the strategy that's been handed down to them is you need to protect Randy, at least for now. We need to appear as a united front. But if I was a Liberal minister, that would bother me. I'd be screaming from the rooftops that this is not right. At the very least, we need some sort of investigation. And Randy needs to be either removed from cabinet, removed from caucus, or criminal charges need to be laid, because this sounds like fraud.
Well, here's the problem. As we've learned, if you stand up and you want to do something right in the Liberal cabinet, that's when you get ousted. But here's the thing. I think we've seen every single Liberal minister with a backbone and with any shred of integrity. I think we've seen them all, because they're no longer in government because they've been kicked out.
Right.
And we do have an office that can look into claims of fraudulent behavior and apply a variety of penalties. And so I can't specifically give a general sweeping statement because, of course, different companies have different circumstances. But I would expect that anyone who's contracting through the federal government ensure that the laws of the land are upheld, including ensuring that fraud is not rewarded.
Thank you. Thank you. So Randy Boissonnault is a cabinet minister in the government of Canada. He's your colleague. He falsely claimed to be Indigenous in order to steal money set aside for Indigenous-owned businesses. As the Minister of Indigenous Services, will you commit to holding your colleague to account for running a company that falsely claimed to be Indigenous?
Well, as you know, first of all, I just want to reiterate that any false claims of indigeneity hurts the goal that I think you're obviously in favor of, which is increasing Indigenous economic activity in this country. And so
as
I would
the
say that
as the Minister of Indigenous Services, what will you do to hold your cabinet colleague to account for trying to defraud the government of Canada by claiming to be an Indigenous-owned business when they weren't?
I think I've been clear that Mr. Boissonnault's company has never been on the list.
That's not the question I'm asking. His actions speak for themselves. He claimed to be Indigenous. He claimed to be running an Indigenous business in order to access the set-aside that was meant for Indigenous-owned businesses. Will you join other members of Parliament in calling for his resignation? This file falls directly under your authority. And if you can go back to the Indigenous communities in your riding and tell them that he should not be held to account, that what he does was just fine, I think they will have something to say about that. You are the Minister of Indigenous Services. You have ministerial accountability. And when you know for fact that one of your colleagues has defrauded or attempted to defraud the Government of Canada by claiming to be an Indigenous-owned business for the sole purpose of accessing something that they shouldn't have access to, I think you have a duty to call that member to account, especially when it falls under your jurisdiction as a minister.
See, Kelly Block speaks very softly, but
She's very direct.
she's very direct.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
And she lets you know that you're an idiot without telling you that you're an idiot.
yeah, she just has this way of kind of making you feel meek in the opposite way that Larry Brock does.
Yeah.
Like, Larry Brock will hammer you over the head with the law and his voice and his stare. Kelly Block will do it just with the soft tone of her voice, and she cuts through it.
It's almost like if you have an older female figure in your life, maybe your mom or your grandma or an aunt, and they're like very disappointed in you, and this is why. Like, that's how she does it.
You know what? Put it this way. You would never want to swear in front of Kelly Block. Like, you would feel dirty doing it. Because she just garners so much respect.
She does.
So, the interesting thing is we intended to just record most of committee today. And as luck would have it, a story just broke from Global News. This is what broke, and you'll see the irony immediately. Police investigating Randy Boissonneau's former company business partner. So that isn't distinctively saying they're only investigating Stephen Anderson. They're investigating his company and Stephen Anderson. As calls mount for Liberal Cabinet Minister Randy Boissonneau to resign over conflicting claims about his family's Indigenous heritage, Global News has learned Edmonton police are investigating an allegation of fraud made against Boissonneau's former company and business partner. Michael Weber, a Florida-based lawyer who is the legal counsel for medical supply procurement company 4M Medical LLC, said he submitted a police report on July 31st regarding 4M Medical's failed transaction with Global Health Imports. The Edmonton Police Services confirmed that the complaint is under investigation. Boissonneau co-founded medical supply company Global Health Imports, GHI, with Stephen Anderson, a former hockey coach, in early 2020. The Edmonton Centre MP said he resigned from the company after he was re-elected and appointed to cabinet in the fall of 2021. He remained a 50% shareholder in the company until June, when he surrendered his stake.
Well, and we learned that within 60 days of appointment to cabinet, the ministers are supposed to be reporting to the Office of the Ethics Commissioner all of their holdings, all of their assets that are greater than $10,000. And then within another 60 days, the Office of the Ethics Commissioner is supposed to tell them what they need to divest or put in a blind trust.
So what that means is 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago, I guess, maybe more than 3 years ago at this point. Holy moly. 3 years ago, Randy didn't disclose this, because if he disclosed it, then he would have received guidance from the ethics commissioner of what to divest, and then he would have done so. And if he didn't do so, the ethics commissioner would have checked back in and said, hey, you haven't gotten back to us on what you've actually done and the proof of you actually doing it.
Now, MPs and ministers can have a financial stake in businesses, but they have to put it into a blind trust. And what that means is somebody else, somebody they hire, is in control of the company. So that individual is the one that makes the decisions. Often it's not even just an individual, it's a group of individuals or a board. Essentially, it takes it out of that minister or that MP's hands so that the control of their company, any decisions that are made, are not made by the MP or the minister, and therefore aren't in conflict of interest.
So the reason why this is a problem is Randy Boissonneau didn't do that, and he still had 50% stake, which means he still has a 50% controlling interest in this company.
Right.
And it continued to bid and receive government contracts after he became a minister.
Right. If memory serves, he received, or the company obtained, I should say, a government contract with Elections Canada this past January. Nothing was executed, no money exchanged hands, but the contract was still signed.
Right. So I imagine the minute Elections Canada learned that this was Randy Boissonneau's company and all hell broke loose, they were probably like, yeah, that's a problem. That's a big problem. So this is
a bad situation for Boissonneau. Like, and it keeps getting worse.
Yeah, and so they're just, you know what, the NDP described this really, really well. It is a car crash in slow motion. And earlier today, the NDP stood up with the Conservatives, can you believe it, and called on Randy Boissonneau to resign. So you now have the NDP, which is ideologically opposite of the Conservatives, but they're agreeing that Randy Boissonneau should be resigning. So we also heard that Indigenous leaders are now standing up and saying Randy Boissonneau needs to resign because they are just so upset, and that's the polite word.
To say that's putting it mildly.
The fact that Randy Boissonneau had been going around, speaking Cree at the beginning of his engagements and talking about his full-blooded woman great-grandmother, and none of it's true. None of it's true. And the fact that his company claimed to be Indigenous owned in order to actually bid on government contracts. So wow, this is like the Titanic going down. And here's the problem. You see in committee, the Liberals aren't doing anything, and they're just parroting these talking points while Trudeau is off at the G20. So
it's going to be interesting to see what happens when he gets back.
Yeah.
Because I don't think the Conservatives are going to let the heat off. And I don't think the media is this time either. Like, this story just broke. This is Tuesday night that we're recording this. And the story just broke. I think a lot of the ministers in cabinet, and you could say even a lot of the Liberal MPs, I think they've got a streak of narcissism. So when they stand up there talking about their heritage that may or may not be accurate, and everybody around them is praising them and telling them how brave and special they are, they feed off that.
So you have the scenario where the Liberals have been trying to manufacture scandals against the Conservatives, have trying to blame them about things.
Yeah, look at our CBC video that we just did this week.
But the problem is that even that strategy, it's being undone because of how corrupt their own cabinet is. Like, it's like every other week something new comes up that just swats their efforts into the trash.
Right, like they planned this whole narrative about how there was 17 Conservatives that wrote letters to access the Housing Accelerator Fund, and now they're not allowed to do it, and this and that. Check out the video for the full explanation. But the point is, they're making this scenario that's not true, but they're manufacturing it. And now the truth of their own scandals is completely burying the garbage they're creating.
Yeah, their manufacturer scandal, gone. It is gone out of the news cycle. It lasted maybe an hour.
And one outlet picked it up, and that was CBC.
Yeah, it was like CBC and CTV kind of said something as well, but gone. Now it is the Randy Boissonneau show and the SDTC scandal show all over again.